Chapter 16. The Mold of Man. Right after lunch, Don Juan and I sat down to talk. He started without any preamble. He announced that we had come to the end of his explanation. He said that he had discussed with me in painstaking detail all the truths about awareness that the old seers had discovered. He stressed that I now knew the order in which the new seers had arranged them. In the last sessions of his explanation, he said he had given me a detailed account of the two forces that aid our assemblage points to move, the Earth's boost and the rolling force. He had also explained the three techniques worked out by the new seers: stalking, intent, and dreaming, and their effects on the movement of the assemblage point. Now, the only thing left for you to do before the explanation of the mastery of awareness is completed, he went on, is to break the barrier of perception by yourself. You must move your assemblage point unaided by anyone and align another great band of emanations. Not to do this will turn everything you've learned and done with me into merely talk, just words. And words are fairly cheap. He explained that when the assemblage point is moving away from its customary position and reaches a certain depth, it breaks a barrier that momentarily disrupts its capacity to align emanations. We experience it as a moment of perceptual blankness. The old seers called that moment the wall of fog, because a bank of fog appears whenever the alignment of emanations falters. He said that there were three ways of dealing with it. It could be taken abstractly as a barrier of perception. It could be felt as the act of piercing a tight paper screen with the entire body. Or it could be seen as a wall of fog. In the course of my apprenticeship with Don Juan, he had guided me countless times to see the barrier of perception. At first I had liked the idea of a wall of fog. Don Juan had warned me that the old seers had also preferred to see it that way. He said that there is great comfort and ease in seeing it as a wall of fog, but that there is also the grave danger of turning something incomprehensible into something somber and foreboding. Hence, his recommendation was to keep incomprehensible things incomprehensible, rather than making them part of the inventory of the first attention. After a short-lived feeling of comfort in seeing the wall of fog, I had to agree with Don Juan that it was better to keep the transition period as an incomprehensible abstraction. But by then it was impossible for me to break the fixation of my awareness. Every time I was placed in a position to break the barrier of perception, I saw the wall of fog. On one occasion in the past, I had complained to Don Juan and Gennaro that although I wanted to see it as something else, I couldn't change it. Don Juan had commented that that was understandable because I was morbid and somber, that he and I were very different in this respect. He was light-hearted and practical, and he did not worship the human inventory. I, on the other hand, was unwilling to throw my inventory out the window, and consequently, I was heavy, sinister, and impractical. I had been shocked and saddened by his harsh criticism and became very gloomy. Don Juan and Gennaro had laughed until tears rolled down their cheeks. Gennaro had added that on top of all that, I was vindictive and had a tendency to get fat. They had laughed so hard, I finally felt obliged to join them. Don Juan had told me then that exercises of assembling other worlds allowed the assemblage point to gain experience in shifting. I had always wondered, however, how to get the initial boost to dislodge my assemblage point from its usual position. When I'd questioned him about it in the past, he pointed out that since alignment is the force that is involved in everything, intent is what makes the assemblage point move. I asked him again about it. "You're in a position now to answer that question yourself," he replied. "The mastery of awareness is what gives the assemblage point its boost. After all, there is really very little to us human beings. We are, in essence, an assemblage point fixed at a certain position. Our enemy, and at the same time our friend, is our internal dialogue, our inventory. Be a warrior. Shed off your internal dialogue. Make your inventory and then throw it away. The new seers make accurate inventories and then laugh at them. Without the inventory, the assemblage point becomes free." Don Juan reminded me that he had talked a great deal about one of the most sturdy aspects of our inventory, our idea of God. That aspect, he said, was like a powerful glue that bound the assemblage point to its original position. If I were going to assemble another true world with another great band of emanations, I had to take an obligatory step in order to release all ties from my assemblage point. That step is to see the mold of man, he said. You must do that today, unaided. "What's the mold of man?" I asked. "I've helped you see it many times," he replied. "You know what I'm talking about." I refrained from saying that I did not know what he was talking about. If he said that I had seen the mold of man, I must have done that, although I did not have the foggiest idea what it was like. He knew what was going through my mind. He gave me a knowing smile and slowly shook his head from side to side. "The mold of man is a huge cluster of emanations in the great band of organic life," he said. "It is called the mold of man because the cluster appears only inside the cocoon of man. The mold of man is the portion of the ego's emanations that seers can see directly without any danger to themselves." There was a long pause before he spoke again. "To break the barrier of perception is the last task of the mastery of awareness," he said. "In order to move your assemblage point to that position, you must gather enough energy. Make a journey of recovery. Remember what you've done." I tried unsuccessfully to recall what was the mold of man. I felt an excruciating frustration that soon turned into real anger. I was furious with myself, with Don Juan, with everybody. Don Juan was untouched by my fury. He said matter-of-factly that anger was a natural reaction to the hesitation of the assemblage point to move on command. It will be a long time before you can apply the principle that your command is the eagle's command, he said. That's the essence of the mastery of intent. In the meantime, make a command now, not to fret, not even at the worst moments of doubt. It will be a slow process until that command is heard and obeyed, as if it were the eagle's command. He also said that there was an unmeasurable area of awareness in between the customary position of the assemblage point and the position where there are no more doubts, which is almost the place where the barrier of perception makes its appearance. In that unmeasurable area, warriors fall prey to every conceivable misdeed. He warned me to be on the lookout and not lose confidence, for I would unavoidably be struck at one time or another by gripping feelings of defeat. The new seers recommend a very simple act when impatience or despair or anger or sadness comes their way. He continued. They recommend that warriors roll their eyes. Any direction will do. I prefer to roll mine clockwise. The movement of the eyes makes the assemblage point shift momentarily. In that movement, you will find relief. This is in lieu of true mastery of intent. I complained that there was not enough time for him to tell me more about intent. It will all come back to you someday, he assured me. One thing will trigger another. One key word, and all of it will tumble out of you, as if the door of an overstuffed closet had given way. He went back then to discussing the mold of man. He said that to see it on my own, unaided by anyone, was an important step, because all of us have certain ideas that must be broken before we are free. The seer who travels into the unknown to see the unknowable must be in an impeccable state of being. He winked at me and said that to be in an impeccable state of being is to be free of rational assumptions and rational fears. He added that both my rational assumptions and my rational fears were preventing me at that moment from realigning the emanations that would make me remember seeing the mold of man. He urged me to relax and move my eyes in order to make my assemblage point shift. He repeated over and over that it was really important to remember having seen the mold before I see it again. And since he was pressed for time, there was no more room for my usual slowness. I moved my eyes as he suggested. Almost immediately, I forgot my discomfort, and then a sudden flash of memory came to me, and I remembered that I had seen the mold of man. It had happened years earlier, on an occasion that had been quite memorable to me. Because from the point of view of my Catholic upbringing, Don Juan had made the most sacrilegious statements I had ever heard. It had all started as a casual conversation while we hiked in the foothills of the Sonoran Desert. He was explaining to me the implications of what he was doing to me with his teachings. We had stopped to rest, and had sat down on some large boulders. He had continued explaining his teaching procedure, and this had encouraged me to try for the 100th time to give him an account of how I felt about it. It was evident that he did not want to hear about it anymore. He made me change levels of awareness and told me that if I would see the mold of man, I might understand everything he was doing and thus save us both years of toil. He gave me a detailed explanation of what the mold of man was. He did not talk about it in terms of the eagle's emanations, but in terms of a pattern of energy that serves to stamp the qualities of humaneness on an amorphous blob of biological matter. At least I understood it that way, especially after he further described the mold of man using a mechanical analogy. He said that it was like a gigantic die that stamps out human beings endlessly, as if they were coming to it on a mass production conveyor belt. He vividly mimed the process by bringing the palms of his hands together with great force, as if the die molded a human being each time its two halves were clapped. He also said that every species has a mold of its own, and every individual of every species molded by the process shows characteristics particular to its own kind. He began then an extremely disturbing elucidation about the mold of man. He said that the old seers, as well as the mystics of our world, have one thing in common. They have been able to see the mold of man, but not understand what it is. Mystics throughout the centuries have given us moving accounts of their experiences. But these accounts, however beautiful, are flawed by the gross and despairing mistake of believing the mold of man to be an omnipotent, omniscient creator. And so is the interpretation of the old seers, who called the mold of man a friendly spirit, a protector of man. He said that the new seers are the only ones who have the sobriety to see the mold of man and understand what it is. What they have come to realize is that the mold of man is not a creator, but the pattern of every human attribute we can think of, and some we cannot even conceive. The mold is our God because we are what it stamps us with, and not because it has created us from nothing and made us in its image and likeness. Don Juan said that in his opinion, to fall on our knees in the presence of the mold of man reeks of arrogance and human self-centeredness. As I heard Don Juan's explanation, I got terribly worried. Even though I had never considered myself to be a practicing Catholic, I was shocked by his blasphemous implications. I had been politely listening to him, yet I had been yearning for a pause in his barrage of sacrilegious judgments in order to change the subject. But he went on, drumming his point in a merciless way. I finally interrupted him and told him that I believed that God exists. He retorted that my belief was based on faith and, as such, was a second-hand conviction that did not amount to anything. My belief in the existence of God was, like everyone else's, based on hearsay and not on the act of seeing, he said. He assured me that even if I was able to see, I was bound to make the same misjudgment that mystics have made. Anyone who sees the mold of man automatically assumes that it is God. He called the mystical experience a chance scene, a one-shot affair that has no significance whatsoever, because it is the result of a random movement of the assemblage point. He asserted that the new seers are indeed the only ones who can pass a fair judgment on this matter, because they have ruled out chance scenes and are capable of seeing the mold of man as often as they please. They have seen, therefore, that what we call God is a static prototype of humaneness without any power. For the mold of man cannot under any circumstances help us by intervening in our behalf, or punish our wrongdoings, or reward us in any way. We are simply the product of its stamp. We are its impression. The mold of man is exactly what its name tells us it is: a pattern, a form, a cast that groups together a particular bunch of fiber-like elements, which we call man. What he had said put me in a state of great distress, but he seemed unconcerned with my genuine turmoil. He kept on needling me with what he called the unforgivable crime of the chance seers, which makes us focus our irreplaceable energy on something that has no power whatsoever to do anything. The more he talked, the greater my annoyance. When I became so annoyed that I was about to shout at him, he had me change into yet a deeper state of heightened awareness. He hit me on my right side, between my hip bone and my rib cage. That blow sent me soaring into a radiant light, into a diaphanous source of the most peaceful and exquisite beatitude. That light was a haven, an oasis in the blackness around me. From my subjective point of view, I saw that light for an immeasurable length of time. The splendor of the sight was beyond anything I can say. And yet I could not figure out what it was that made it so beautiful. Then the idea came to me that its beauty grew out of a sense of harmony, a sense of peace and rest, of having arrived, of being safe at long last. I felt myself inhaling and exhaling in quietude and relief. What a gorgeous sense of plenitude! I knew beyond a shadow of doubt that I had come face to face with God, the source of everything. And I knew that God loved me. God was love and forgiveness. The light bathed me, and I felt cleaned, delivered. I wept uncontrollably, mainly for myself. The sight of that resplendent light made me feel unworthy, villainous. Suddenly I heard Don Juan's voice in my ear. He said that I had to go beyond the mold, that the mold was merely a stage, a stopover that brought temporary peace and serenity to those who journey into the unknown. but that it was sterile, static. It was at the same time a flat, reflected image in a mirror, and the mirror itself. And the image was man's image. I passionately resented what Don Juan was saying. I rebelled against his blasphemous, sacrilegious words. I wanted to tell him off, but I could not break the binding power of my scene. I was caught in it. Don Juan seemed to know exactly how I felt and what I wanted to tell him. "You can't tell the Nahual off," he said in my ear. "It is the Nahual who's enabling you to see. It is the Nahual's technique, the Nahual's power. The Nahual is the guide." It was at that point that I realized something about the voice in my ear. It was not Don Juan's, although it sounded very much like his voice. Also, the voice was right. The instigator of that scene was the Nahual Juan Matus. It was his technique and his power that was making me see God. He said it was not God, but the mold of man. I knew that he was right. Yet I could not admit that. Not out of annoyance or stubbornness, but simply out of a sense of ultimate loyalty to and love for the divinity that was in front of me. As I gazed into the light with all the passion I was capable of, the light seemed to condense, and I saw a man. A shiny man that exuded charisma, love, understanding, sincerity, truth. A man that was the sum total of all that is good. The fervor I felt on seeing that man was well beyond anything I had ever felt in my life. I did fall on my knees. I wanted to worship God personified. But Don Juan intervened and whacked me on my left upper chest, close to my clavicle, and I lost sight of God. I was left with a tantalizing feeling, a mixture of remorse, elation, certainties, and doubts. Don Juan made fun of me. He called me pious and careless, and said I would make a great priest. Now I could even pass for a spiritual leader who had had a chance seeing of God. He urged me in a jocular way to start preaching and describe what I had seen to everyone. In a very casual but seemingly interested manner, he made a statement that was part question, part assertion. "And the man," he asked, "you can't forget that God is a male." The immensity of something indefinable began to dawn on me as I entered into a state of great clarity. "Very cozy, eh?" Don Juan added, smiling. "God is a male. What a relief." After recounting to Don Juan what I had remembered, I asked him about something that had just struck me as being terribly odd. To see the mold of man, I had obviously gone through a shift of my assemblage point. The recollection of the feelings and realizations I had had then was so vivid that it gave me a sense of utter futility. Everything I had done and felt at that time, I was feeling now. I asked him how it was possible that, having had such a clear comprehension, I could have forgotten it so completely. It was as if nothing of what had happened to me had mattered. For I always had to start from point one, regardless of how much I might have advanced in the past. That's only an emotional impression, he said. A total misapprehension. Whatever you did years ago is solidly enclosed in some unused emanations. That day, when I made you see the mold of man, for instance, I had a true misapprehension myself. I thought that if you saw it, you would be able to understand it. It was a true misunderstanding on my part. Don Juan explained that he had always regarded himself as being very slow to understand. He had never had any chance of testing his belief because he did not have a point of reference. When I came along and he became a teacher, which was something totally new to him, he realized that there is no way to speed up understanding, and that to dislodge the assemblage point is not enough. He had thought that it would be sufficient. Soon he became aware that since the assemblage point normally shifts during dreams, sometimes to extraordinarily distant positions, whenever we undergo an induced shift, we are all experts at immediately compensating for it. We rebalance ourselves constantly, and activity goes on as if nothing has happened to us. He remarked that the value of the new seer's conclusions does not become evident until one tries to move someone else's assemblage point. The new seer said that what counts in this respect is the effort to reinforce the stability of the assemblage point in its new position. They considered this to be the only teaching procedure worth discussing, and they knew that it is a long process that has to be carried out little by little at a snail's pace. Don Juan said then that he had used power plants at the beginning of my apprenticeship in accordance with the recommendation of the new seers. They knew by experience and by seeing that power plants shake the assemblage point way out of its normal setting. The effect of power plants on the assemblage point is in principle very much like that of dreams. Dreams make it move, but power plants manage the shift on a greater and more engulfing scale. A teacher then uses the disorienting effects of such a shift to reinforce the notion that the perception of the world is never final. I remembered then that I had seen the mold of man 5 more times over the years. With each new time, I had become less passionate about it. I could never get over the fact, however, that I always saw God as a male. At the end, it stopped being God for me and became the mold of man. Not because of what Don Juan had said, but because the position of a male God became untenable. I could then understand Don Juan's statements about it. They had not been blasphemous or sacrilegious in the least. He had not made them from within the context of the daily world. He was right in saying that the new seers have an edge in being capable of seeing the mold of man as often as they want. But what was more important to me was that they had sobriety in order to examine what they saw. I asked him why it was that I always saw the mold of man as a male. He said that it was because my assemblage point did not have the stability then to remain completely glued to its new position and shifted laterally in man's band. It was the same case as seeing the barrier of perception as a wall of fog. What made the assemblage point move laterally was a nearly unavoidable desire or necessity to render the incomprehensible in terms of what is most familiar to us. A barrier is a wall, and the mold of man cannot be anything else but a man. He thought that if I were a woman, I would see the mold as a woman. Don Juan stood up then and said that it was time for us to take a stroll in town, that I should see the mold of man among people. We walked in silence to the square, but before we got there, I had an uncontainable surge of energy and ran down the street to the outskirts of town. I came to a bridge, and right there, as if it had been waiting for me, I saw the mold of man as a resplendent, warm, amber light. I fell on my knees, not so much out of pity, but as a physical reaction to awe. The sight of the mold of man was more astonishing than ever. I felt, without any arrogance, that I had gone through an enormous change since the first time I had seen it. However, all the things I had seen and learned had only given me a greater, more profound appreciation for the miracle that I had in front of my eyes. The mold of man was superimposed on the bridge at first. Then I refocused my eyes and saw that the mold of man extended up and down into infinity. The bridge was but a meager shell, a tiny sketch superimposed on the eternal. And so were the minute figures of people who moved around me, looking at me with unabashed curiosity. But I was beyond their touch. Although at that moment I was as vulnerable as I could be. The mold of man had no power to protect me or spare me, yet I loved it with a passion that knew no limits. I thought that I understood then something that Don Juan had told me repeatedly, that real affection cannot be an investment. I would have gladly remained the servant of the mold of man, not for what it could give me, for it has nothing to give, but for the sheer affection I felt for it. I had the sensation of something pulling me away, and before I disappeared from its presence, I shouted a promise to the mold of man. But a great force whisked me away before I could finish stating what I meant. I was suddenly kneeling at the bridge while a group of peasants looked at me and laughed. Don Juan got to my side and helped me up and walked me back to the house. There are two ways of seeing the mold of man, Don Juan began as soon as we sat down. You can see it as a man, or you can see it as a light. That depends on the shift of the assemblage point. If the shift is lateral, the mold is a human being. If the shift is in the midsection of man's band, the mold is a light. The only value of what you've done today is that your assemblage point shifted in the midsection. He said that the position where one sees the mold of man is very close to that where the dreaming body and the barrier of perception appear. That was the reason the new seers recommend that the mold of man be seen and understood. Are you sure you understand what the mold of man really is? He asked me with a smile. I assure you, Don Juan, that I'm perfectly aware of what the mold of man is, I said. I heard you shouting inanities to the mold of man when I got to the bridge, he said, with a most malicious smile. I told him that I had felt like a worthless servant worshipping a worthless master, and yet I was moved out of sheer affection to promise undying love. He found it all hilarious and laughed until he was choking. The promise of a worthless servant to a worthless master is worthless, he said, and choked again with laughter. I did not feel like defending my position. My affection for the mold of man was offered freely, without thought of recompense. It did not matter to me that my promise was worthless. Chapter 17. The Journey of the Dreaming Body. Don Juan told me that the two of us were going to drive to the city of Oaxaca for the last time. He made it very clear that we would never be there together again. Perhaps his feeling might return to the place, he said, but never again the totality of himself. In Oaxaca, Don Juan spent hours looking at mundane, trivial things. The faded colors of walls, the shape of distant mountains, the pattern on cracked cement, the faces of people. Then we went to the square and sat on his favorite bench, which was unoccupied, as it always was when he wanted it. During our long walk in the city, I had tried my best to work myself into a mood of sadness and moroseness, but I just could not do it. There was something festive about his departure. He explained it as the unrestrainable vigor of total freedom. Freedom is like a contagious disease, he said. It is transmitted. Its carrier is an impeccable Nahual. People might not appreciate that, and that's because they don't want to be free. Freedom is frightening. Remember that. But not for us. I have groomed myself nearly all my life for this moment, and so will you. He repeated over and over that at the stage where I was, no rational assumptions should interfere with my actions. He said that the dreaming body and the barrier of perception are positions of the assemblage point, and that knowledge is as vital to seers as knowing how to read and write is to modern man. Both are accomplishments attained after years of practice. It is very important that you remember right now the time when your assemblage point reached that position and it created your dreaming body, he said with tremendous urgency. Then he smiled and remarked that time was extremely short. He said that the recollection of the main journey of my dreaming body would put my assemblage point in a position to break the barrier of perception in order to assemble another world. The dreaming body is known by different names. He said, after a long pause, "The name I like the best is the other. That term belongs to the old seers, together with the mood. I don't particularly care for their mood, but I have to admit that I like their term, the other. It's mysterious and forbidden. Just like the old seers, it gives me the feeling of darkness, of shadows. The old seers said that the other always comes shrouded in wind." Over the years, Don Juan and other members of his party had tried to make me aware that we can be in two places at once, that we can experience a sort of perceptual dualism. As Don Juan spoke, I began to remember something so deeply forgotten that at first it was as if I had only heard about it. Then, step by step, I realized that I had lived that experience myself. I had been in two places at once. It happened one night in the mountains of northern Mexico. I had been collecting plants with Don Juan all day. We had stopped for the night, and I had nearly fallen asleep from fatigue, when suddenly there was a gust of wind, and Don Gennaro sprang up from the darkness right in front of me and nearly scared me to death. My first thought was one of suspicion. I believed that Don Gennaro had been hiding in the bushes all day, waiting for darkness to set in before making his terrifying appearance. As I looked at him prancing around, I noticed that there was something truly odd about him that night. Something palpable, real, and yet something I could not pinpoint. He joked with me and horsed around, performing acts that defied my reason. Don Juan laughed like an idiot at my dismay. When he judged that the time was right, he made me shift into heightened awareness. And for a moment, I was able to see Don Juan and Don Gennaro as two blobs of light. Gennaro was not the flesh and blood Don Gennaro that I knew in my state of normal awareness, but his dreaming body. I could tell because I saw him as a ball of fire that was above the ground. He was not rooted as Don Juan was. It was as if Gennaro, the blob of light, were on the verge of taking off, already up in the air, a couple of feet off the ground, ready to zoom away. Another thing I had done that night, which suddenly became clear to me as I recollected the event, was that I knew automatically that I had to move my eyes in order to make my assemblage point shift. I could, with my intent, align the emanations that made me see Gennaro as a blob of light. Or I could align the emanations that made me see him as merely odd, unknown, strange. When I saw Gennaro as odd, his eyes had a malevolent glare, like the eyes of a beast in the darkness. But they were eyes nonetheless. I did not see them as points of amber light. That night, Don Juan said that Gennaro was going to help my assemblage point shift very deeply, that I should imitate him and follow everything he did. Gennaro stuck out his rear end and then thrust his pelvis forward with great force. I thought it was an obscene gesture. He repeated it over and over again, moving around as if he were dancing. Don Juan nudged me on the arm, urging me to imitate Gennaro. And I did. Both of us sort of romped around, performing that grotesque movement. After a while, I had the feeling that my body was exuding the movement on its own, without what seemed to be the real me. The separation between my body and the real me became even more pronounced. And then, at a given instant, I was looking at some ludicrous scene where two men were making lewd gestures at each other. I watched in fascination, and I realized that I was one of the two men. The moment I became aware of it, I felt something pulling me, and I found myself again thrusting my pelvis backward and forward in unison with Gennaro. Almost immediately, I noticed that another man standing next to Don Juan was watching us. The wind was blowing around him. I could see his hair being ruffled. He was naked and seemed embarrassed. The wind gathered around him as if protecting him, or perhaps the opposite, as if trying to blow him away. I was slow to realize that I was the other man. When I did, I got the shock of my life. An imponderable physical force pulled me apart as if I were made out of fibers. And I was again looking at a man that was me, romping around with Gennaro, gaping at me while I looked. And at the same time, I was looking at a naked man that was me, gaping at me while I made lewd gestures with Gennaro. The shock was so great that I broke the rhythm of my movements and fell down. The next thing I knew, Don Juan was helping me to stand up. Gennaro and the other me, the naked one, had disappeared. I had also remembered that Don Juan had refused to discuss the event. He did not explain it, except to say that Gennaro was an expert in creating his double, or the other, and that I had had long interactions with Gennaro's double in states of normal awareness without ever detecting it. That night, as he had done hundreds of times before, Gennaro made your assemblage point shift very deep into your left side. Don Juan commented, after I had recounted to him everything I had remembered. His power was such that he dragged your assemblage point to the position where the dreaming body appears. You saw your dreaming body watching you, and his dancing did the trick. I asked him to explain to me how Gennaro's lewd movement could have produced such a drastic effect. "You're a prude," he said. "Gennaro used your immediate displeasure and embarrassment at having to perform a lewd gesture. Since he was in his dreaming body, he had the power to see the eagle's emanations. From that advantage, it was a cinch to make your assemblage point move." He said that whatever Gennaro had helped me to do that night was minor. That Gennaro had moved my assemblage point and made it produce a dreaming body many, many times. But that those events were not what he wanted me to remember. "I want you to realign the proper emanations and remember the time when you really woke up in a dreaming position," he said. A strange surge of energy seemed to explode inside me, and I knew what he wanted me to remember. I could not, however, focus my memory on the complete event. I could only recall a fragment of it. I remembered that one morning, Don Juan, Don Gennaro, and I had sat on that very same bench while I was in a state of normal awareness. Don Gennaro said all of a sudden that he was going to make his body leave the bench without getting up. The statement was completely out of the context of what we had been discussing. I was accustomed to Don Juan's orderly, didactic words and actions. I turned to Don Juan, expecting a clue, but he remained impassive, looking straight ahead, as if Don Gennaro and I were not there at all. Don Gennaro nudged me to attract my attention, and then I witnessed a most disturbing sight. I actually saw Gennaro on the other side of the square. He was beckoning me to come. But I also saw Don Gennaro sitting next to me, looking straight ahead, just as Don Juan was. I wanted to say something, to express my awe, but I found myself dumbstruck, imprisoned by some force around me that did not let me talk. I again looked at Gennaro across the park. He was still there, motioning to me with a gesture of his head to join him. My emotional distress mounted by the second. My stomach was getting upset. And finally, I had tunnel vision. A tunnel that led directly to Gennaro on the other side of the square. And then a great curiosity, or a great fear, which seemed to be the same thing at that moment, pulled me to where he was. I actually soared through the air and got to where he was. He made me turn around and pointed to the three people who were sitting on a bench in a static position, as if time had been suspended. I felt a terrible discomfort, an internal itching, as if the soft organs in the cavity of my body were on fire. And then I was back on the bench, but Gennaro was gone. He waved goodbye to me from across the square and disappeared among the people going to the market. Don Juan became very animated. He kept on looking at me. He stood up and walked around me. He sat down again and could not keep a straight face as he talked to me. I realized why he was acting that way. I had entered into a state of heightened awareness without being helped by Don Juan. Gennaro had succeeded in making my assemblage point move by itself. I laughed involuntarily upon seeing my writing pad, which Don Juan solemnly put inside his pocket. He said that he was going to use my state of heightened awareness to show me that there is no end to the mystery of man, end to the mystery of the world. I focused all my concentration on his words. However, Don Juan said something I did not understand. I asked him to repeat what he had said. He began talking very softly. I thought he had lowered his voice so as not to be overheard by other people. I listened carefully, but I could not understand a word of what he was saying. He was either speaking in a language foreign to me, or it was mumbo-jumbo. The strange part of it was that something had caught my undivided attention. Either the rhythm of his voice, or the fact that I had forced myself to understand. I had the feeling that my mind was different from usual, although I could not figure out what the difference was. I had a hard time thinking, reasoning out what was taking place. Don Juan talked to me very softly in my ear. He said that since I had entered into heightened awareness without any help from him, my assemblage point was very loose, and that I could let it shift into the left side by relaxing, by falling half asleep on that bench. He assured me that he was watching over me, that I had nothing to fear. He urged me to relax, to let my assemblage point move. I instantly felt the heaviness of being deeply asleep. At one moment, I became aware that I was having a dream. I saw a house that I had seen before. I was approaching it as if I were walking on the street. There were other houses, but I could not pay any attention to them. Something had fixed my awareness on the particular house I was seeing. It was a big, modern stucco house with a front lawn. When I got closer to that house, I had a feeling of familiarity with it, as if I had dreamed of it before. I walked on a gravel path to the front door. It was open, and I walked inside. There was a dark hall and a large living room to the right, furnished with a dark red couch and matching armchairs set in a corner. I was definitely having tunnel vision. I could see only what was in front of my eyes. A young woman was standing by the couch, as if she had just stood up as I came in. She was lean and tall, exquisitely dressed in a tailored green suit. She was perhaps in her late 20s. She had dark brown hair, burning brown eyes that seemed to smile, and a pointed, finely chiseled nose. Her complexion was fair, but had been tanned to a gorgeous brown. I found her ravishingly beautiful. She seemed to be an American. She nodded at me, smiling, and extended her hands with the palms down, as if she were helping me up. I clasped her hand in a most awkward movement. I scared myself and I tried to back away. But she held me firmly, and yet so gently. Her hands were long and beautiful. She spoke to me in Spanish, with a faint trace of an accent. She begged me to relax, to feel her hands, to concentrate my attention on her face, and to follow the movement of her mouth. I wanted to ask her who she was, but I could not utter a word. Then I heard Don Juan's voice in my ear. He said, "Oh, there you are," as if he had just found me. I was sitting on the park bench with him, but I could also hear the young woman's voice. She said, "Come and sit with me." I did just that, and began a most incredible shifting of points of view. I was alternately with Don Juan and with that young woman. I could see both of them as clearly as anything. Don Juan asked me if I liked her, if I found her appealing and soothing. I could not speak, but somehow I conveyed to him the feeling that I did like that lady immensely. I thought, without any overt reason, that she was a paragon of kindness, that she was indispensable to what Don Juan was doing with me. Don Juan spoke in my ear again, and said that if I liked her that much, I should wake up in her house. That my feeling of warmth and affection for her would guide me. I felt giggly and reckless. A sensation of overwhelming excitation rippled through my body. I felt as if the excitation were actually disintegrating me. I did not care what happened to me. I gladly plunged into a blackness, black beyond words. And then I found myself in the young woman's house. I was sitting with her on the couch. After an instant of sheer animal panic, I realized that somehow I was not complete. Something was missing in me. I did not, however, find the situation threatening. The thought crossed my mind that I was dreaming and that I was presently going to wake up on the park bench in Oaxaca with Don Juan, where I really was, where I really belonged. The young woman helped me to get up and took me to a bathroom where a large tub was filled with water. I realized then that I was stark naked. She gently made me get into the tub and held my head up while I floated in it. After a while, she helped me out of the tub. I felt weak and flimsy. I lay down on the living room couch, and she came close to me. I could hear the beating of her heart and the pressure of blood rushing through her body. Her eyes were like two radiant sources of something that was not light or heat, but curiously in between the two. I knew that I was seeing the force of life projecting out of her body through her eyes. Her whole body was like a live furnace. It glowed. I felt a weird tremor that agitated my whole being. It was as if my nerves were exposed and someone was plucking them. The sensation was agonizing. Then I either fainted or fell asleep. When I woke up, someone was putting face towels soaked in cold water on my face and the back of my neck. I saw the young woman sitting by my head on the bed where I was lying. She had a pail of water on a night table. Don Juan was standing at the foot of the bed with my clothes draped over his arm. I was fully awake then. I sat up. They had covered me with a blanket. "How's the traveler?" Don Juan asked, smiling. "Are you in one piece now?" That was all I could remember. I narrated this episode to Don Juan, and as I talked, I recalled another fragment. I remembered that Don Juan had taunted and teased me about finding me naked in the lady's bed. I had gotten terribly irritated at his remarks. I had put on my clothes and stomped out of the house in a fury. Don Juan had caught up with me on the front lawn. In a very serious tone, he had remarked that I was my ugly, stupid self again, that I had put myself together by being embarrassed, which had proved to him that there was still no end to my self-importance. But he had added, in a conciliatory tone, that that was not important at the moment. What was significant was the fact that I had moved my assemblage point very deeply into the left side, and consequently I had traveled an enormous distance.